Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is James Buchanan, Part 3, 15th U.S. President. We stopped last time in 1857. James Buchanan had been elected the 15th U.S. President in November of 1856, fulfilling his ambition, lifelong dream of him and many others. The inauguration came in March. And James Buchanan had had this long career in politics, and he had had contact with 10 presidents, from James Monroe to Franklin Pierce. And as I said, he long wanted to be president. James Buchanan said, quote, "The great object of my administration will be to arrest, if possible, the agitation of the slavery question at the North, and to destroy sectional parties. Should a kind providence enable me to succeed in my efforts to restore harmony to the Union, I shall feel I have not lived in vain." In the election, Buchanan received 1.8 million votes, and the Republican nominee, John C. Fremont, 1.3 million. Now, south of the Mason-Dixon line, Fremont received less than 7,000 votes. So the Republican Party was only popular in the North, but the Democrats, at least at this point, still had national popularity. Now, backing up in January in Washington, James Buchanan had contracted a debilitating dysentery called the National Hotel Disease, which was the result of frozen pipes spilling fecal matter into the hotel's kitchen and cooking water. And Buchanan was sick for months. Quote, "He worried that he might faint or worse during his inaugural speech, and so a doctor sat in the front row, handy with brandy and smelling salts." All members of Buchanan's cabinet were pro-union and above sectional desire. March 4th was Inauguration Day, and Buchanan biographer Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan's inaugural address had been sincere if unexciting. That was its purpose, his purpose and the country's need." Now, President Buchanan's daily routine at the White House, he would wake up at 6:30 in the morning. By 8 o'clock, he would have finished his breakfast. Then he would meet visitors until noon. And then he'd have his lunch and have an hour stroll along Lafayette Square, the residential district north of the White House. Dinner at 7 o'clock p.m. Before he would retire, he would read the Bible and other religious works and then go to bed at midnight. There was great excitement in Washington City during the social season. Reportedly, things had been dull since Martin Van Buren. During the presidencies of John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, and Franklin Pierce, supposedly there had not been apparently a lot of fun parties. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "The campaign of 1856 put into the White House a wealthy Epicurean, a gay bachelor with a flair for society, and a Chesterfieldian knowledge of its ways." Now, there's a story of Lewis Cass, his Secretary of State. That was a political appointment. He was quite elderly. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "At cabinet meetings, Cass rarely said much, but kept opening and closing his mouth and sucking his breath between his teeth, as if he constantly tasted something disagreeable." Now, 2 days after the inauguration, on March 6th, the Dred Scott decision came down. Dred Scott was a slave that had been brought north by his owner into two free states, Illinois and Wisconsin, and somehow he had demanded or wanted to achieve his freedom, and it became a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Roger Taney released the decision that slavery could exist in the North. That he ruled against Dred Scott. According to the court, Dred Scott would continue to be a slave in the North. Now, this was really big news and shattering, very upsetting in the North. Basically, it meant that the whole country was every state was a slave state. It kind of removed the whole idea of being a free state if slave owners could bring their slaves to the North. So this was very upsetting, and of course the slavery issue continued to divide the country. So this was, folks in the South apparently supported this, or at least the slave interests, but the people in the North were very upset about this, that the northern states were becoming slave states. President Buchanan announced that he would only serve one term. He was elderly. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan's supreme confidence in himself might have been his greatest asset had he become president in 1844 or 1848, for he then was in touch with the national scene. But for a decade he had been either out of office or out of the country, and lightning changes had been in progress. The friends he trusted and the enemies he understood had died or passed from view. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, James K. Polk, nearly all those he had known in the House and the Senate and in state politics were gone. He did not know the new generation, and it did not know him. The president had become very nearly a political stranger in his own country." Now, there was this ongoing trouble with Kansas. It was very complicated, a real mess, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were fighting as Kansas edged towards statehood and whether Kansas would become a slave or a free state. There were two territorial governments, a pro-slavery one in Lecompton and an anti-slavery one in Topeka. There was violence and civil war in Kansas. 1,500 U.S. troops, Army troops, were sent to try to keep the peace. Now, President Buchanan had to choose between these two state governments, and he recognized Lecompton. Reportedly, Topeka represented 3 times the number of people as Lecompton. President Buchanan pushed for Kansas to be admitted as a slave state, and reportedly that move shattered the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was losing its northern support. 1857, there was an economic crisis, financial crisis, the Panic of 1857. There were bank failures, fear and terror on Wall Street. 1,400 banks failed. The textile mills closed. There were hungry workmen in the public squares of northern cities, and the chant was bread or blood. And apparently this was caused by land speculation. Another issue was with the territory in Utah and a conflict with Mormons there over the issue of polygamy, where Mormons had this tradition where men could have more than one wife. Reportedly, that this was a way for widows to be cared for in old age, that they would, but this was controversial. And anyway, a settlement, the army was sent to Utah, but a settlement was negotiated between the U.S. government and the Mormons in Utah. By 1858, the Democratic Party was weakening in the North. It was seen as a pro-slavery party. Republicans, so you had actually Whigs joining the Republican Party and Northern Democrats as well. The Republican Party was becoming powerful, and it controlled the House of Representatives. 1858, the U.S. government started the negotiation to eventually purchase Russian Alaska. Alaska was a Russian territory at that time. And President Buchanan was able to negotiate reciprocal trade treaties with Brazil and France, and also a trade treaty with China, which increased trade with China. Now, 1859, October 16th, John Brown with his 3 sons and 15 followers, white and black, attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on the Potomac River, supposedly hoping to ignite a slave rebellion. Robert E. Lee was in the U.S. Army. He was tasked with capturing Brown and his followers, which he did. Of course, Lee eventually became the top leader in the Civil War for the Confederacy. So John Brown was captured. He was tried, convicted, and hanged for his actions. Now, the thing is, many folks in the North, or a fair number of them, saw John Brown as a hero. because they saw him as a hero fighting the evil of slavery. Now in the South, however, they believed he was a villain because this was their greatest fear, having a slave rebellion. And folks in the South were very upset by the popularity of Brown in the North. At any rate, as we've said repeatedly, the slavery conflict was growing worse and worse. In 1860, the Prince of Wales was visiting Canada. President Buchanan wrote Queen Victoria and suggested the prince visit the United States, and she agreed. And he became the first member of the British royal family to visit the United States. There was big excitement. President Buchanan's niece Harriet wanted to plan a big ball at the White House, but President Buchanan ruled, quote, "No dancing in the White House." Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "When President Buchanan spoke thus, his decision was as irrevocable as the law of the Medes and the Persians." However, there was a grand state dinner, and Philip S. Klein described, quote, "Later the guests played cards, a great concession, since President Buchanan detested card games and had never before allowed them in the White House. At the end of the day, after the royal family had been accommodated, President Buchanan discovered that all the White House beds were full, and he had to sleep on a sofa." The visit was a big success. It symbolized the end of the traditional hatreds between the U.S. and the United Kingdom and the beginning of a stronger Anglo-American friendship. In the 1860 presidential election, the Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln was elected. This led to South Carolina and 6 other southern states leaving the U.S. or seceding. James Buchanan was not nominated. The Democrats were divided. There were 3 candidates: Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge. Douglas was a northern candidate, John Breckinridge in the south, and there was also the Union Party John Bell. Anyway, because the Democrats were divided, this really helped Abraham Lincoln win. And however, the consensus or belief in the South was that the Republican Party was so anti-South, anti-Southern, anti-slavery that they could not accept a Republican president. And so this meant that the Union was in peril. President Buchanan enjoyed reading the Bible, especially the book of Ecclesiastes, and the line, quote, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils?" South Carolina leaders had long said that if Abraham Lincoln was elected, that South Carolina would withdraw from the Union. The day after the election, the federal grand jury in Charleston, South Carolina, all quit. All officers of the federal district court resigned. Federal activity, there was federal activity in South Carolina stopped except for the post office, customs house, and military posts. Now there was a major question. Did the states or does any state have the right of secession? Now the argument was, well, the Constitution was they all joined voluntarily. After the American Revolution, they were not joined in a strong central government until the U.S. Constitution, and it was all voluntary. So anyway, this became a debatable point. General Winfield Scott, who was the top military leader, he publicly said yes, which encouraged secession. In 1860, the U.S. Army had 15,000 men, only 1,000 soldiers in the East. The rest were in the West, involved with the Indian Wars and protecting American settlers. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "The wide-flung frontiers called desperately for more troops than were ever available. To withdraw any Western company meant almost certain death to the nearby inhabitants, for these military posts provided their only protection from hostile Indians. The morale of the Army had suffered for years from the excessive demands made upon the soldiers. Long marches, hard labor, continued Indian fighting against heavy odds, and perpetual sickness were routine. Since there were no replacements, there were no furloughs." President Buchanan had a cabinet meeting on November 9th regarding the issues with South Carolina and the South. Now, in other problems, Massachusetts and Wisconsin and other northern states were defying the fugitive slave law. In other words, they did not want to participate in capturing escaped slaves in the North. This was an obstruction of federal law. Again, the issue, the debate was, does a state have the right to leave the United States and become independent? There was apparently Republican support, it's all debatable, for the right of secession. The principle was that the government was by the consent of the governed. In other words, that these states had to want to be in the Union. If they didn't want to be in, they could leave. And so that was arguing that secession was a natural right. Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor in New York, wrote, quote, "We hope never to live in a republic where of one section is pinned to the residue by bayonets." So he was supporting the right of secession. Now, President Buchanan publicly said that the South did not have the right to secession. When Louisiana seceded, this closed the mouth of the Mississippi River, so the Western states relied on the Mississippi to get their products to market, so they were very much against the secession of Louisiana. On December 3rd, President Buchanan had a message for Congress, the annual message. He blamed anti-slavery agitators in the North for the crisis. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "One half the nation would not live habitually and perpetually insecure, and only those who had threatened to bathe the South in blood could dissipate the fears they aroused. The Southerners, on the other hand, had no excuse to break up the Union because a president they distrusted had been legally elected. The government of the United States was intended to be perpetual and had the duty to preserve itself. The power to make war against a state is at variance with the whole spirit of the Constitution. We could not, by physical force, control the will of the people and compel them to elect senators and representatives to Congress. Our Union rests upon public opinion and can never be cemented by the blood of its citizens shed in civil war. If it cannot live in the affections of the people, it must one day perish. Congress possesses many means of preserving it by conciliation, but the sword was not placed in their hand to preserve it." Now, President-elect Abraham Lincoln was quiet. He did not speak publicly. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln thought the threat of secession humbug and war unlikely. President Buchanan had a much more accurate knowledge of the temper of the South than Lincoln, who had not held national office for a decade and who rarely visited outside Illinois." Now, the major issue was with South Carolina and the federal forts there. There was obviously a conflict. These forts needed supplies. The two forts were Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. Now, there was a lot of criticism of President Buchanan. This was obviously a very tough situation. He was called a traitor for favoring secession. December 20th, South Carolina officially seceded from the United States. President Buchanan's response was the seceding states could go in peace. The U.S. government had no authority to coerce them to stay. In December, biographer Gene H. Baker described President Buchanan, quote, "His hair was askew. He was unable some days to lift himself out of bed. He cursed and wept, and his hands trembled. President Buchanan gave every indication of severe mental strain, affecting both his health and judgment. Throughout his life, James Buchanan enjoyed the company of Southerners. Their grace and courtesy, even their conversational talents, attracted him. He sought out the company of these white aristocrats and absorbed their ideals." South Carolina wanted the United States to surrender the federal forts there, but President Buchanan refused to turn them over. December 28th, President Buchanan had a meeting with commissioners from South Carolina in the White House who demanded federal troops out of Charleston. On that same day, South Carolina seized Fort Moultrie, which had been abandoned, and Castle Pinckney, the U.S. Custom House. However, President Buchanan refused to give up Fort Sumter. Abraham Lincoln, who was the incoming president, his position was he was against the extension of slavery into the territories. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, President Buchanan now recognized that Abraham Lincoln did not dare to support any peaceful move which might settle the crisis for fear of disrupting his own party. So Fort Sumter was under federal control, and President Buchanan was determined to defend Fort Sumter. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, importuned, threatened, warned, begged, pushed, pulled, and shoved in every direction, bombarded by plans and propositions, until he resentfully complained that he had not time even to say his prayers. The president at length became distraught and despaired of achieving a solution. Inflexible secessionists and unyielding Republicans controlled the issue. There was no New Year's Eve jollification at the White House, December 31st, 1860. In January, there was a visitor who reported, quote, I have never seen President Buchanan so solemn. He remarked that nothing but the interposition of an all-wise providence could save our country, that he despaired of being able to do anything himself. Florida and Alabama took over the federal property in their states. There was a meeting planned in February, representatives from South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas to create the Confederate States of America, and the meeting was planned for Montgomery, Alabama. On February 7th, 7 states in the American South formed the Confederate States of America, a new nation. The immediate issue was the resupply of Fort Sumter. Now, there was no congressional support for a war. There was a threat of an attack by Washington City. Washington was between Virginia and Maryland, 2 slave states, although neither so far had joined the Confederacy. President Troop was called for troops to defend the capital. Former President John Tyler headed a peace mission who came to meet with President Buchanan. And they asked that there be no military display on the George Washington birthday parade. This became a big mess. It was on again, off again. President Buchanan thought, we need to do it. And they thought, they kept changing their minds. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, most wearily of all, the officers of men who had been dismissed several hours before got back into their uniforms and prepared to celebrate the birthday of the father of their tottering country. Regarding his cabinet, Gene H. Baker wrote, quote, for a lonely man, its members must be friends who would fill his days with conversation, share his dinners, and as later transpired when their wives were out of town, sleep in the White House. For 6 weeks in 1861, when chaos overtook the Buchanan White House, his newly appointed Secretary of the Treasury, John Dix, slept there at the president's insistence. Dix soon discovered that a distraught Buchanan liked to come to his room late at night to discuss with the president doing most of the talking, the disintegration of the United States. March 4th of 1861 was the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. A reporter described, quote, James Buchanan appeared pale and wearied, yet his face beamed with radiance, for he felt relieved from the crushing care and anxiety he had borne for 4 years. James Buchanan said to President-elect Lincoln, quote, my dear sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed. Abraham Lincoln responded, quote, Mr. President, I cannot say that I shall enter it with much pleasure, but I assure you that I shall do what I can to maintain the high standards set by my illustrious predecessors who have occupied it. Now, regarding during the inaugural address, it was written, quote, James Buchanan sat quietly, breathing a kind of freedom he had not known for 50 years. He was out of politics. he could go home in peace, peace for himself and his country. So his presidency came to an end. Now, Gene H. Baker, who was a very critical biographer, wrote, quote, "In his betrayal of the national trust, Buchanan became closer to committing treason than any other president in American history." I completely disagree with that comment, but that's a popular opinion among historians. During the Civil War, James Buchanan was a strong supporter of the Union. March 5th was his departure day, going home to Pennsylvania. There was a special railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. He arrived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania to a hero's welcome, a 34-gun presidential salute, a 2-mile parade from the train station to the town square. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "In the house, his library began to take shape again. Familiar books back on familiar shelves, the comfortable chair before his desk, his slippers, the old dressing gown, a good cigar, and a bottle of Madeira wine. Life was almost worth living." On April 12, 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard of the South Carolina Army, under orders from the Confederate States of America, fired artillery cannon fire on Fort Sumter, and this was the beginning of the Civil War in the United States. James Buchanan wrote, quote, "The Confederate States have deliberately commenced a civil war, and God knows where it will end." Now, when the war started and continued, public opinion in his hometown of Lancaster was anti-James Buchanan. And then there was in the newspapers a lot of criticism against him. Quote, "The manifestations of popular indignation against the man who might have, had he the will or pluck, have nipped this rebellion in the bud, as Andrew Jackson did before him." So that his critics were saying, well, he could have stopped this if he sent the military in right at the beginning, but that's all speculation, and I don't think it's true, because the Civil War, it was a different time, because there was so much. Civil War went on for so long. But anyway, people like to criticize. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "He had just celebrated his 71st birthday, a day which he had long anticipated as the time when he would begin to enjoy the ease of an honored old age in Wheatland. Now he knew that the greatest fight of his life lay ahead. For the next 5 years, James Buchanan faced a lonely struggle against overwhelming odds to counteract the lies about him, which filled northern newspapers in intervals between the more exciting battle news." The Republican Party became standard propaganda to say things against James Buchanan for political reasons. They said that he was involved in a conspiracy to aid the secession. Total lie. Was not true. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "The author of such a terrible war must be made to pay. The world should know how President Buchanan brought this Holocaust upon his countrymen." See, that was just dishonesty, and he was being scapegoated. This was really a crime against this good man. James Buchanan quickly learned as the assault developed that he could not make any public defense while the war lasted. Any explanation he offered would only be seized and turned as a weapon against him. This became a myth. It was a myth that James Buchanan committed treason that became, quote, "firmly established in the public mind." Well, as I mentioned earlier, that criticism continues. James Buchanan described himself as, quote, "on the rock of St. Helena." He's comparing himself to Napoleon. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan watched the lies piled on one another until they comprised such a mass of uncontradicted vilification that neither his effort nor the passage of a century would sponge it from the public mind." Yeah, so these lies are still accepted today. They've become as if they were true. One of the lies was that he was in constant correspondence with foreign governments, encouraging them to recognize the Confederacy. it became Republican Party policy, standard policy to villainize James Buchanan. In 1863, the Confederate Army was 10 miles from Wheatland during the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, around that time. James Buchanan was warned to leave his home, that it wasn't safe, but he refused. He said, quote, "I felt no alarm at the approach of the rebels, and with the help of God would not have removed from Wheatland had I been surrounded by 100,000 of them. I have schooled my mind to meet the inevitable evils of life with Christian fortitude." The Confederates did not reach his home. So the war ended in 1865. The Union the country remained one. The Union was preserved. The following year, James Buchanan published a 300-page book. The title was Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, telling his side of the story. James Buchanan wrote, quote, "The Civil War grew out of 50 years of persistent hostility and violence between North and South over slavery. Many grievous errors were committed by both parties from the beginning." I think it's a very fair statement. From the beginning of the war, Buchanan was an outspoken supporter of the Union. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "Despite the harsh and bitter epithets coined by the party presses for both Buchanan and Lincoln, these two never spoke ill of each other. Each knew, as did no other two people in America, the staggering complexities and uncertainties which the president must face." James Buchanan wrote this about Abraham Lincoln. He called him, quote, "a man of honest heart and true manly feelings, an honest and patriotic man, a man of kindly and benevolent heart, and of plain, sincere, and frank manners." In 1867, James Buchanan wrote, quote, "The makers of the U.S. Constitution dreaded lest the vast powers conferred upon the federal government might be perverted to usurp the reserved rights of the states. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." So he's talking about the balance, which is, of course, today gone so far toward the federal side and away from state power. James Buchanan wrote to a friend in 1867, quote, "I am happy that our tastes on so many subjects are the same, and that we both delight in the classical dish of sauerkraut. Many pretenders to refinement despise this honest German dish, but we know better." Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan's housekeeper, Miss Hetty, filled him with sauerkraut till he groaned, but he never complained." He knew after the war, he was still being blamed for the war, scapegoat. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan wondered painfully how many of the families broken by war felt the same. In Lancaster, he knew there were many who blamed him for their losses." A friend wrote to Buchanan that he and this friend were the only surviving members of the House of Representatives from 1821. Buchanan wrote back, quote, "Truly, we both live in the midst of posterity." 1868, James Buchanan died at his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Wheatland, at the age of 77. He had suffered from rheumatism and dysentery. He was susceptible to infection and had pneumonia before he died. There was a 2.5-mile funeral parade with 125 carriages. A simple obelisk was erected over his grave. He was buried at Woodward Hill Cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He died on June 1st. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "His request to be buried without pomp or parade went unheeded. 20,000 people came to his funeral, so there were still supporters." His eulogy said, quote, "His great private virtues, integrity, charity, kindness, and courtesy." Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan exemplified in his private conduct simplicity of manners, unfailing courtesy, and a kindly consideration for others. Although proud of his own attainments, he remained familiar and unaffected in his relations with others, treating his barber, his gardener, and his poor relatives with no less regard and attention than he gave to people of eminence, in the sense that he appreciated and respected people for their personal qualities, regardless of station. He practiced the Republican ideal. James Buchanan believed that a constitutional republic represented man's greatest invention in the art of government. In his public and private life, he demonstrated mental toughness and moral stamina. Beyond common humanity, he was devoted to duty, industrious in ascertaining facts, tenacious of his principles, and nearly always in control of himself. James Buchanan assumed leadership of the United States when an unprecedented wave of angry passion was sweeping over the nation. That he held the hostile sections in check during these revolutionary times was in itself a remarkable achievement. His many talents, which in a quieter era might have gained for him a place among the great presidents of his country, were quickly overshadowed by the cataclysmic events of Civil War and by the towering personality of Abraham Lincoln. James Buchanan had a problem with his neck that caused his head to be continually tilted to his left. He was nearsighted in one eye and farsighted in the other. In conversation, he would close his farsighted eye, look across the room, and then close the nearsighted eye, made the appearance of a wink. Before his death, James Buchanan said, quote, "I have always felt and still feel that I discharged every public duty imposed on me conscientiously. I have no regret for any public act of my life and history will vindicate my memory." Well, this video is an effort to vindicate his memory, which hasn't been vindicated yet very well. Theodore Roosevelt liked to contrast Buchanan presidents and Lincoln presidents, so obviously he was a critic of James Buchanan. Philip S. Klein wrote, quote, "James Buchanan was the relentless foe of fanatics and demagogues, a man who held that reason and restraint were the essentials of good government, and who bent all his energies to achieve by means of law and diplomacy what others sought to accomplish by civil war. In the closing months of his term of office, he refused to yield to the demands of extremists, both Northern and Southern, for he knew that either course would precipitate a war which almost no one wanted. Harry Truman was president in 1947, had this to say about the White House, quote, "The floors pop and crack all night. Anyone with imagination can see old Jim Buchanan walking up and down and worrying about conditions not of his making. The tortured souls who were here and are misrepresented in history are the ones who come back. It's a hell of a place." Now, for these 3 videos on James Buchanan, I read 2 biographies, James Buchanan by Gene H. Baker, 2004, and James Buchanan, President James Buchanan, a biography by Philip S. Klein, 1962. In conclusion, James Buchanan lived a life of noble public service. He came from very humble circumstances, worked hard all his life, did well financially, and served his country in many different ways as Secretary of State. And in Congress, he deserves credit for the impossible situation he found himself in on the verge of the Civil War, and understanding for that heartbreaking situation he was in, because the Civil War itself, he was blamed for not starting the Civil War when it was the biggest nightmare in American history. He deserves a lot of credit. He should not be villainized. This condemnation of him, he was not a traitor. He was a good man. He was an impossible situation, trying to keep North and South together when the slavery issue was so divisive, and there was and goodwill had been lost between North and South. God bless James Buchanan, a man who served his country well. That concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time in our American History series with the 16th U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln, Part 1. Good luck to you with your efforts in history. Hope you find a good history book to read. There are so many of them wonderful history books to read, you might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 711 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, you might consider, and are looking for a high school, you might consider Ressalist Educational Center. Ressalist is located on Allenby Street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines. At Ressalist, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional high schools. Ressalist is more than a school, it's a warm, supportive community, and we strive to be creative and innovative. And the website is ressalist.education, RESALEST. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.